The stage was set for what promised to be another lively episode of one of the most popular political talk shows on television. The audience buzzed with anticipation as they waited for the guest everyone had been talking about, Richard Wolff, the outspoken economist known for his sharp critiques of capitalism and his unrelenting focus on economic inequality. Wolff wasn't just any commentator. He was a man who could make even the most seasoned politicians squirm under the weight of his arguments. His reputation preceded him, and tonight he was here to share his thoughts on some of the biggest names in politics. As the host introduced Wolff, the camera panned to him walking onto the set. He carried himself with an air of confidence, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to reflect his no-nonsense personality. The audience erupted into applause, many eager to hear what he had to say. Wolff smiled politely, waving briefly before taking his seat. The host greeted him warmly, calling him one of the most brilliant minds in economics today. It was clear that Wolff was accustomed to such praise, but he nodded modestly, ready to dive into the discussion. The conversation began with a few general questions about the state of the economy, which Wolff answered with his usual flair. He spoke passionately about how capitalism often favored the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people, pointing out examples where corporate greed had left workers struggling. His words resonated with parts of the audience, especially those who felt disillusioned by the current system. But then, the host shifted gears, asking Wolff for his thoughts on former President Donald Trump, a topic guaranteed to spark controversy. Wolff didn't hesitate. With a sly grin, he launched into a critique of Trump that quickly turned into outright mockery. "Donald Trump," he began, leaning back in his chair as if settling in for a good story, "is like a child playing dress-up in a world he doesn't fully understand." The audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or take offense. Wolff pressed on, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Here's a man who claims to be a master businessman, yet his track record is riddled with bankruptcies and questionable deals. And let's not forget the way he brags about being rich while pushing policies that benefit the ultra-wealthy." He went on to describe Trump's approach to economics as amateurish and self-serving, accusing him of prioritizing his own interests over those of the American people. Wolff painted a picture of a leader who cared more about appearances than substance, someone who used flashy rhetoric to mask a lack of real achievement. As he spoke, the audience alternated between laughter and murmurs of agreement. Many were clearly entertained by Wolff's biting humor, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension building in the room. But Wolff wasn't done yet. He leaned forward now, his voice rising slightly as he grew more animated. "And let's talk about his so-called economic miracle," he said, air-quoting the phrase with exaggerated gestures. "Tax cuts for the rich? Deregulation that hurts the environment? These aren't solutions, they're band-aids slapped onto gaping wounds." He shook his head dramatically, as if marveling at the absurdity of it all. "Trump talks a big game, but when you look under the hood, there's nothing but smoke and mirrors." By this point, the audience was fully engaged, hanging on every word. Some clapped enthusiastically, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Wolff's delivery was undeniably entertaining, filled with wit and theatrical flair. Yet beneath the surface there was an edge to his words, an almost personal disdain for Trump that made the critique feel less like analysis and more like a verbal takedown. It was clear that Wolff wasn't just critiquing Trump's policies. He was mocking the man himself, painting him as a bumbling figure unworthy of serious consideration. As the segment wore on, Wolff continued to pile on the criticism, leaving little room for nuance. He dismissed Trump's supporters as misguided, suggesting they had been duped by charisma rather than convinced by logic. Each comment drew louder reactions from the audience, though not always in agreement. Some cheered wildly, clearly enjoying the spectacle, while others frowned, perhaps feeling that Wolff's tone bordered on condescending. Still, the energy in the room was undeniable. Whether they agreed with him or not, everyone was captivated by the sheer force of Wolff's personality. What none of them realized, however, was that this was only the beginning. Unbeknownst to Wolff and to the audience, a challenger was waiting in the wings, ready to step up and defend the very ideas he had so thoroughly ridiculed. The host glanced at the clock, signaling that it was time to introduce the next guest. Wolff, still riding high on the momentum of his performance, didn't notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Little did he know, the tables were about to turn in ways he couldn't have anticipated. As Richard Wolff wrapped up his scathing critique of Donald Trump, the host turned to the camera with a practiced smile and announced the next guest. "Joining us now is Karoline Leavitt," he said, his tone shifting slightly as if preparing the audience for something unexpected. The name may not have been instantly recognizable to everyone in the room, but those who followed political commentary closely knew exactly who she was. Karoline Leavitt was quickly becoming a rising star on the conservative circuit, a young, articulate woman known for her ability to hold her own against even the toughest critics. The cameras cut to the entrance of the stage, and there she was, walking confidently toward her seat. Dressed in a crisp blazer and tailored trousers, Leavitt exuded professionalism without coming across as stiff or overly formal. Her presence commanded attention, not because she demanded it, but because there was an undeniable air of calm determination about her. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the audience briefly before settling onto the host and then glancing at Wolff, who had just finished his tirade. If she felt any nerves, she didn't show them. Instead, she greeted the host warmly, shaking hands before taking her place beside Wolff. Leavitt's demeanor stood in stark contrast to Wolff's fiery energy. Where he had been animated and almost theatrical in his delivery, she was composed and deliberate, her movements measured and precise. As she settled into her chair, the host introduced her, highlighting her background as a former White House aide and her current role as a vocal advocate for Republican values. He emphasized her knack for challenging liberal narratives, hinting that tonight's discussion might take an interesting turn. The audience murmured appreciatively, intrigued by what was to come. Wolff glanced at Leavitt out of the corner of his eye, perhaps sizing her up. He likely assumed she would be another predictable voice from the right, someone who would parrot talking points without much depth. But Leavitt wasn't here to play that role. From the moment she opened her mouth, it became clear that she had done her homework, and she wasn't afraid to challenge one of the most respected voices on the left. "Thank you for having me," she began, her voice steady and warm. She directed her first comment to Wolff himself, acknowledging his expertise in economics while subtly setting the stage for her rebuttal. "Dr. Wolff, I've read some of your work, and I think it's important to recognize the value of critiquing systems like capitalism," she said, nodding respectfully. "But I also believe we need to look at the full picture when discussing figures like President Trump." Her opening statement caught Wolff off guard. Instead of launching directly into a defense of Trump, she chose to frame the conversation, in broader terms, appealing to reason rather than emotion. This strategic move disarmed him momentarily, forcing him to recalibrate his expectations. The audience leaned forward, sensing that this exchange was going to be different from anything they'd seen so far. Leavitt continued, her tone remaining calm, but firm. "You mentioned earlier that President Trump's policies were self-serving and lacked substance," she said, turning slightly toward Wolff. "But let's consider the results of those policies. For example, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. While critics argue it primarily benefited the wealthy, data shows that middle-class families saw significant tax relief, and many small businesses experienced growth as a result." She paused briefly, allowing her words to sink in before delivering her next point. "Isn't it possible that these outcomes align with the needs of working Americans?" Wolff raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but unwilling to concede ground easily. "With respect," he replied, leaning forward in his chair, "tax cuts don't address systemic issues like income inequality or corporate exploitation. They're temporary fixes at best." Leavitt nodded thoughtfully as if considering his response. Then, with a slight smile, she countered, "I agree that tax cuts alone aren't a cure-all solution, but dismissing them entirely ignores the tangible benefits they provided for millions of people. For families struggling to make ends meet, keeping more of their hard-earned money can make a real difference." She went on to cite specific examples, referencing stories of individuals and communities that had thrived under Trump's economic policies. Her arguments weren't just theoretical. They were grounded in real-world experiences that resonated with everyday Americans. As the debate unfolded, Leavitt maintained her composure, never raising her voice or resorting to personal attacks. Instead, she focused on dismantling Wolff's critiques piece by piece, using logic and evidence to build her case. When Wolff accused Trump of prioritizing the wealthy, she pointed to initiatives like Opportunity Zones, which aimed to revitalize economically distressed areas. When he criticized deregulation as harmful, she highlighted industries where reduced red tape had led to job creation and innovation. What made Leavitt's approach particularly effective was her ability to connect with the audience. She spoke plainly, avoiding jargon or overly complex language, and framed her arguments in ways that were relatable. For instance, when discussing trade deals, she explained how renegotiating agreements like NAFTA had helped protect American manufacturing jobs, a topic that hit home for many viewers. By focusing on practical outcomes rather than abstract theories, she managed to humanize Trump's policies in a way that Wolff's sweeping generalizations couldn't. Throughout the exchange, Wolff struggled to regain control of the narrative. His usual confidence wavered as Leavitt systematically challenged his assumptions, forcing him to defend positions he hadn't fully considered. At one point, he attempted to pivot back to his critique of capitalism, arguing that Trump's policies were merely symptoms of a flawed system, but Leavitt anticipated this move, countering with a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Dr. Wolff," she said, leaning forward slightly, "if capitalism is inherently exploitative, as you claim, then why do so many Americans continue to support free market principles? Isn't it possible that President Trump tapped into something deeper, a desire for opportunity and self-reliance that your analysis overlooks?" Her question hung in the air, prompting murmurs of agreement from parts of the audience. Wolff hesitated, visibly searching for a response that wouldn't undermine his core argument. By the time the segment reached its midpoint, it was clear that Leavitt had seized the upper hand. She hadn't just defended Trump. She had reframed the entire conversation, shifting the focus from ideology to impact. The audience, initially divided, now seemed genuinely engaged, hanging on every word as the two debaters traded points. For the first time that evening, Wolff appeared uncertain, his trademark bravado tempered by the realization that he was facing a formidable opponent. As the clock ticked down, Leavitt concluded her remarks with a final appeal to unity. "At the end of the day," she said, looking directly at both Wolff and the camera, "we all want the same thing: prosperity for our nation and opportunities for future generations. The question isn't whether capitalism is perfect, it's how we can work within the system to create meaningful change." Her closing statement earned applause from the audience, signaling that she had struck a chord. While the debate was far from over, one thing was certain: Karoline Leavitt had proven herself to be a force to be reckoned with, and as the show prepared to move into its next segment, it was impossible to ignore the electricity in the room, or the growing sense that this clash of ideologies was only beginning. With the momentum firmly on her side, Karoline Leavitt pressed forward, refusing to let Richard Wolff regain control of the conversation. She had already dismantled several of his arguments with precision and clarity, but she wasn't done yet. Now she shifted gears, aiming her focus squarely on Wolff's ideological blind spots, areas where his critique of capitalism seemed disconnected from the realities faced by ordinary Americans. It was a bold move, one that required both confidence and finesse, and Leavitt executed it flawlessly. "Dr. Wolff," she began, her tone calm but pointed, "you've spent much of this discussion criticizing capitalism as inherently exploitative. But I have to ask, isn't it possible that your perspective overlooks the agency of individuals? Many Americans don't see themselves as victims of the system. They see opportunities within it." Her words hung in the air, challenging Wolff to address a fundamental contradiction in his argument. If capitalism was so oppressive, why did millions of people embrace its principles and work tirelessly to improve their lives through entrepreneurship, innovation, and hard work? Wolff furrowed his brow, clearly caught off guard by the question. He had expected Leavitt to stick to defending Trump, not to pivot into a broader philosophical debate about individual responsibility versus systemic oppression. For a moment, he hesitated, searching for a response that wouldn't undermine his core beliefs. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and replied, "I'm not denying that some individuals succeed under capitalism. But those successes are exceptions, not the rule. The system itself is designed to benefit the wealthy few at the expense of the many." Leavitt nodded thoughtfully, giving the impression that she understood his point, but then she countered, with a story that brought the abstract discussion down to earth. "Let me tell you about someone I met during my time working in rural America," she said, her voice softening slightly as if inviting the audience into a personal moment. There was a single mother named Sarah who ran a small bakery out of her home. She didn't come from privilege or wealth. She worked 2 jobs just to keep her business afloat. But over time, thanks to tax cuts and less restrictive regulations, she was able to expand her shop, hire employees, and provide for her family in ways she never imagined. The audience listened intently, drawn in by the vividness of the anecdote. Leavitt paused briefly, letting the image of Sarah sink in before continuing. "Now, does that mean every small business owner has the same experience? Of course not. But dismissing policies like deregulation because they don't solve every problem ignores the real impact they can have on people's lives. It's easy to critique from an academic standpoint, but when you're living paycheck to paycheck, even small changes can make a big difference." Her argument struck a chord, earning nods of approval from parts of the audience. Wolff, however, wasn't ready to concede. "But what about the long-term consequences?" he interjected, his voice rising slightly. "Deregulation might help a handful of businesses in the short term, but it often leads to environmental damage, worker exploitation, and instability in the economy. We need structural reforms, not band-aids." Leavitt smiled faintly, as if she had anticipated this rebuttal. "I agree that we should hold businesses accountable for protecting the environment and treating workers fairly," she said. "But isn't it also true that excessive regulation can stifle growth and discourage innovation? Take the energy sector, for example. President Trump's efforts to roll back certain restrictions allowed companies to invest in cleaner technologies while creating jobs. Isn't that a win-win?" Wolff frowned, visibly frustrated by how effectively Leavitt was turning his own arguments against him. He tried to steer the conversation back toward inequality, emphasizing the widening gap between rich and poor. "Even if there are isolated examples of success," he argued, "the overall trend is undeniable. Wealth continues to concentrate at the top, leaving everyone else behind." Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I understand your concern about income inequality, Dr. Wolff, but I think we need to be careful about how we define success. For many Americans, success isn't measured solely by wealth. It's about having the freedom to pursue their dreams, support their families, and build better futures for their children. Policies that encourage economic mobility, reduce barriers to entry, and reward hard work align with those values." She went on to highlight specific initiatives from Trump's presidency that embodied these principles, such as expanding apprenticeship programs and investing in workforce development. "These aren't glamorous headlines," she admitted, "but they represent practical steps toward empowering individuals and communities. And isn't empowerment what we're really talking about here?" The audience erupted into applause, clearly moved by Leavitt's passionate defense of personal agency and opportunity. Even some of Wolff's supporters seemed swayed by her ability to connect policy decisions to real-world outcomes. Sensing that she had struck a nerve, Leavitt delivered her final blow, a direct challenge to Wolff's worldview. "Dr. Wolff," she said, locking eyes with him, "you've built your career critiquing systems and advocating for radical change, and while I respect your commitment to addressing inequality, I believe your solutions risk alienating the very people you claim to care about. Most Americans don't want to tear down the system. They want to fix it. They want leaders who will listen to their concerns, remove obstacles, and give them a fair shot at success. That's what President Trump aimed to do, and that's why so many rallied behind him." For the first time that evening, Wolff appeared genuinely shaken. His usual confidence wavered as he struggled to respond to Leavitt's multifaceted attack. He attempted to reiterate his points about systemic flaws, but his arguments lacked the force they had earlier in the segment. The audience could sense the shift in dynamics, and their reactions reflected it. Applause for Leavitt grew louder, while murmurs of doubt rippled through those who had initially sided with Wolff. As the clock ticked down, Leavitt wrapped up her remarks with a message of hope and pragmatism. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and no policy is perfect," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "But dismissing efforts to improve the system as inadequate or misguided only discourages progress. Let's focus on finding common ground and building solutions that empower everyone, not just a select few." Her closing statement earned thunderous applause, signaling that she had won over a significant portion of the audience. Wolff sat quietly, his earlier bravado replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. Though he hadn't been completely silenced, it was clear that Leavitt had succeeded in exposing weaknesses in his argument, and in doing so, she had elevated herself as a formidable voice in the political arena. As the show transitioned to its next segment, viewers couldn't help but reflect on what they had just witnessed. What started as a lopsided critique of Donald Trump had transformed into a nuanced and engaging debate about the role of government, the nature of opportunity, and the power of individual resilience. And at the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, calm, composed, and unshakable, a reminder that conviction and preparation could silence even the sharpest critics. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically. What began as a one-sided critique of Donald Trump by Richard Wolff had transformed into a heated ideological battle between two sharp minds with vastly different perspectives. The audience, initially divided, now seemed fully immersed in the debate, their reactions oscillating between applause and murmurs of contemplation. Karoline Leavitt had not only held her ground, but had also managed to turn the conversation into a broader discussion about wealth inequality, government intervention, and individual responsibility. Sensing that she had struck a nerve, Leavitt pressed further, determined to challenge Wolff on his most deeply held beliefs. Leaning forward slightly, she looked directly at Wolff with an expression that was both respectful and resolute. "Dr. Wolff," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "you've talked a lot about systemic issues like income inequality and corporate greed. And while I agree these are important topics, I think it's worth asking, does focusing solely on the system risk overlooking the power of personal choices? Isn't there value in encouraging people to take ownership of their circumstances and work toward better outcomes?" Wolff raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but wary of where this line of questioning might lead. He hesitated for a moment, before responding, his tone measured but firm. "Of course, individuals have agency," he said, "but we can't ignore the fact that the system itself often limits those choices. For example, someone born into poverty faces far greater obstacles than someone born into wealth. It's not just about effort, it's about access to resources, education, healthcare, and opportunities." Leavitt nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the validity of his point. But instead of conceding, she countered with another real-world example that highlighted the resilience of individuals despite systemic challenges. "I understand what you're saying, Dr. Wolff, and I absolutely agree that access to resources is critical. But let me share another story. A few years ago, I met a young man named Marcus who grew up in inner-city Chicago. His neighborhood was plagued by crime and unemployment, and he didn't have many role models to look up to. Yet, through sheer determination, and yes, some help from community programs, he taught himself coding and eventually landed a job at a tech startup." She paused, letting the weight of the anecdote sink in before continuing. "Now, does that mean every person in Marcus's situation will achieve the same success? No, but it does show that even within flawed systems, people can rise above their circumstances if they're given the tools and encouragement to do so. Shouldn't our policies focus on empowering individuals like Marcus rather than assuming they're powerless without radical change?" Her argument resonated with parts of the audience, particularly those who valued self-reliance and personal initiative. Some clapped enthusiastically, while others exchanged thoughtful glances, clearly moved by the story. Wolff, however, wasn't ready to back down. He leaned forward, his expression intense as he prepared his rebuttal. Empowerment is important, he conceded, but it's not enough. Take healthcare, for instance. Even the hardest working person can be devastated by medical bills or denied treatment because of cost. That's not a failure of individual effort, it's a failure of the system. Leavitt acknowledged his concern, but quickly pivoted to highlight alternative approaches that balanced systemic reform with personal accountability. I completely agree that healthcare is a complex issue, she said. But instead of advocating for sweeping changes that could disrupt the entire system, why not focus on incremental improvements? For example, expanding access to affordable insurance options, investing in preventive care, and lowering prescription drug costs are practical steps that can make a difference without upending everything. Her emphasis on pragmatic solutions struck a chord with many viewers, especially those frustrated by polarizing debates that seemed to offer no middle ground. Wolff, sensing that he was losing ground, tried to steer the conversation back to his central thesis, the need for structural transformation. Incremental changes sound nice in theory, he argued, but history shows us that true progress requires bold action. Look at the New Deal or the Civil Rights Movement. Those weren't achieved through half measures. Leavitt smiled faintly, appreciating the historical reference but seeing an opportunity to connect it to modern realities. You're absolutely right that bold action has driven significant progress in the past, she replied. But today's challenges are different. We live in a highly interconnected world where top-down solutions often create unintended consequences. Instead of imposing rigid frameworks, shouldn't we empower communities to find solutions that work for them? Local leaders, entrepreneurs, and families know their needs better than any distant policymaker ever could. The audience erupted into applause, clearly impressed by Leavitt's ability to weave historical context with contemporary relevance. Even some of Wolff's supporters found themselves nodding along, recognizing the logic in her argument. Sensing that she had gained the upper hand, Leavitt delivered her final salvo, a direct appeal to unity over division. Dr. Wolff, she said, her tone softening but still firm. We may never see eye to eye on everything, and that's okay. But I believe we share a common goal, improving lives and creating opportunities for everyone. Whether it's through systemic reform or individual empowerment, the key is finding ways to lift people up, not tearing each other down. Let's focus on collaboration instead of conflict, and maybe we'll discover that we're not as far apart as we think. Her words hung in the air, prompting a moment of reflection among both the audience and Wolff himself. For the first time, that evening the economist appeared genuinely thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering some of his assumptions. Though he hadn't been fully swayed, it was clear that Leavitt had planted seeds of doubt in his mind, and in the minds of viewers watching at home. As the segment drew to a close, the host thanked both guests for their insightful contributions, though it was evident that Leavitt had stolen the spotlight. Her ability to blend empathy with pragmatism, coupled with her unshakable confidence, had left a lasting impression on everyone present. The audience gave her a standing ovation, signaling that she had not only defended her position but also inspired hope for constructive dialogue across political divides. What started as a mocking critique of Donald Trump had evolved into something much larger, a clash of ideologies that underscored the complexity of addressing societal challenges. And at the heart of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, calm under pressure and unwavering in her convictions, a testament to the power of preparation, perspective, and perseverance. As the heated exchange between Richard Wolff and Karoline Leavitt reached its crescendo, the debate had transcended the confines of a typical political talk show. What began as a critique of Donald Trump's economic policies had morphed into a broader philosophical discussion about wealth inequality, government intervention, and the role of individual responsibility in shaping society. The audience, now fully engaged, was no longer just passive spectators. They were participants in a conversation that mirrored the deep divides gripping the nation. Both Wolff and Leavitt recognized this shift and leaned into it, each determined to make their case with clarity and conviction. Wolff, ever the advocate for systemic change, sought to drive home his argument that capitalism itself was the root cause of many societal problems. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture, he said, his voice rising slightly as if to reclaim control of the narrative. Yes, individuals like Marcus, the young man you mentioned, can overcome obstacles. But how many others don't? How many people are trapped in cycles of poverty because the system is rigged against them? We can't keep pretending that small fixes will solve decades of entrenched inequality. Leavitt listened intently, her expression thoughtful but unwavering. When it was her turn to respond, she chose her words carefully, knowing that this was the crux of the disagreement. "Dr. Wolff, I hear you loud and clear," she began, her tone respectful but firm. "No one is denying that systemic issues exist, they're real and they need to be addressed. But let's not dismiss the potential of incremental progress either. For millions of Americans, even modest improvements in policy can mean the difference between struggling to survive and having a chance to thrive." She went on to highlight specific examples where targeted reforms had yielded tangible results without dismantling entire systems. Take welfare reform under President Clinton, for instance, she explained. It wasn't perfect, but it encouraged work and self-sufficiency while providing a safety net for those who needed it most. Similarly, President Trump's efforts to expand vocational training programs gave countless workers the skills they needed to compete in today's economy. These aren't revolutionary changes, but they matter to the people whose lives they touch. Wolff shook his head, clearly frustrated by what he perceived as an overly simplistic view of complex issues. "But these programs only scratch the surface," he countered. "They don't address the underlying structures that perpetuate inequality. Look at housing discrimination, predatory lending, or the lack of access to quality education in low-income communities. Until we tackle those root causes, we're just putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds." Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she seized the opportunity to bridge the gap between their perspectives, appealing to shared values rather than ideological differences. "I agree that addressing root causes is essential," she said, leaning forward slightly to emphasize her point. "But here's the thing. We don't have to choose between immediate action and long-term reform. Why not do both? For example, expanding affordable housing initiatives doesn't mean we stop advocating for fair lending practices. Investing in early childhood education doesn't mean we abandon efforts to improve K-12 schools. Progress isn't an either-or proposition, it's a continuum." Her ability to find common ground without compromising her principles earned murmurs of approval from the audience. Even some of Wolff's supporters seemed to appreciate her balanced approach, nodding along. As she spoke, sensing that she had struck a chord, Leavitt pressed further, turning the conversation toward the importance of hope and optimism in driving change. "Dr. Wolff," she continued, her voice warm but resolute, "one of the things I admire about your work is your commitment to fighting for a better world. But I worry that focusing solely on the flaws of the system risks fostering cynicism rather than inspiring action. People need to believe that change is possible, that their voices matter, and that their efforts can lead to meaningful outcomes. That's why leaders like President Trump resonated with so many Americans. He tapped into a desire for empowerment, for taking charge of one's destiny rather than waiting for top-down solutions." Wolff sighed deeply, his frustration giving way to a reluctant acknowledgement of her point. "I understand the appeal of empowerment," he admitted, his tone softer now. "But we also have to be honest about the limitations of individual effort in the face of structural barriers. It's not enough to tell someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps if they don't even have boots." The audience chuckled at the metaphor, breaking the tension momentarily. Leavitt smiled, seizing the lighter moment to inject a note of humor into her rebuttal. "Fair point," she said with a grin, "but maybe the solution is to make sure everyone has boots, and then teach them how to lace them up properly." Her quip drew laughter and applause, lightening the mood while reinforcing her argument. As the segment neared its conclusion, the host interjected, sensing that the debate had reached a natural endpoint. "This has been an incredible discussion," he said, looking between Wolff and Leavitt. "Both of you have presented compelling arguments, and I think our audience has gained a lot from hearing such diverse perspectives." Wolff nodded graciously, though there was a hint of introspection in his expression. For all his confidence and expertise, he couldn't deny that Leavitt had challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her emphasis on practical solutions and personal agency had forced him to reconsider some of his assumptions, even if he remained steadfast in his belief in systemic reform. Leavitt, for her part, exuded quiet satisfaction. She had entered the interview knowing she would face a formidable opponent, yet she had managed to hold her own, and then some. More importantly, she had demonstrated that ideological debates didn't have to devolve into shouting matches. By staying calm, focused, and respectful, she had elevated the conversation, proving that civility and conviction could coexist. As the cameras cut away for a commercial break, the audience erupted into applause once again, this time more sustained and enthusiastic. Many lingered in their seats, eager to discuss what they had just witnessed. Social media lit up with reactions as viewers debated which side had made the stronger case. Some praised Wolff for his intellectual rigor and unflinching critique of capitalism, while others hailed Leavitt as a rising star who embodied the best of conservative thought, principled, pragmatic, and persuasive. For Wolff, the experience served as a reminder of the power of dialogue, even when it started with mockery. Though he remained committed to his ideals, he couldn't help but reflect on the nuances Leavitt had brought to the table. For Leavitt, the encounter solidified her reputation as a force to be reckoned with, earning her invitations to speak on other platforms and cementing her status as a leading voice in conservative media. In the end, the debate transcended partisan lines, offering a glimpse of what constructive discourse could look like. While neither side had fully convinced the other, the exchange left a lasting impression on everyone involved, a testament to the enduring value of engaging with opposing viewpoints. As the credits rolled and the studio lights dimmed, one thing was clear. The clash of ideologies had sparked something far greater than either participant could have imagined. The debate between Richard Wolff and Karoline Leavitt had come to an end, but its impact was only beginning to ripple outward. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the audience remained abuzz with energy, reluctant to leave their seats. Conversations erupted in clusters throughout the room as viewers dissected every moment of the heated exchange. Social media platforms lit up almost instantly, with clips from the segment spreading like wildfire. Memes, sound bites, and hashtags began trending, capturing the essence of what many saw as a defining moment in political discourse. For Karoline Leavitt, the aftermath was nothing short of transformative. Her performance had not only silenced one of the sharpest critics on the left, but also showcased her ability to articulate conservative principles in a way that resonated with a broad audience. Within hours, video clips of her rebuttals went viral, drawing praise from commentators across the ideological spectrum. Supporters hailed her as a rising star who could bridge divides through reasoned argument and unshakable composure. Critics, too, acknowledged her skill, even if they disagreed with her views. The consensus was clear. Leavitt had arrived on the national stage, and she wasn't leaving anytime soon. Media outlets scrambled to book her for interviews, eager to capitalize on the momentum generated by her appearance. Cable news shows invited her to discuss everything from economic policy to cultural issues, positioning her as a fresh voice in an often polarized landscape. Conservative podcasts and talk radio programs lined up to feature her, while liberal hosts extended invitations to engage in further debates. Each appearance solidified her reputation as someone who could hold her own against any opponent, no matter how formidable. Meanwhile, Richard Wolff found himself reflecting on the encounter in ways he hadn't anticipated. Known for his intellectual rigor and unwavering critique of capitalism, Wolff had entered the interview confident in his arguments. Yet Leavitt's calm yet incisive responses had forced him to confront blind spots in his worldview. While he remained steadfast in his belief that systemic reform was necessary, he couldn't deny the power of her emphasis on individual agency and incremental progress. In interviews following the show, Wolff admitted that Leavitt had challenged him in meaningful ways, prompting him to refine his arguments and consider alternative perspectives. The viral nature of the debate sparked conversations far beyond the confines of traditional media. Online forums and comment sections buzzed with analysis, as users debated which side had made the stronger case. Some praised Wolff for his unflinching critique of capitalism, arguing that his warnings about wealth inequality were more urgent than ever. Others celebrated Leavitt's defense of personal responsibility, seeing it as a refreshing counterbalance to what they viewed as overly pessimistic critiques of the system. Even those who didn't align with either ideology appreciated the civility and depth of the discussion, lamenting the rarity of such thoughtful exchanges in today's polarized climate. In the days that followed, both participants became symbols of larger ideological battles. For conservatives, Leavitt represented hope, a new generation of leaders willing to defend their values without resorting to hostility or defensiveness. For progressives, Wolff embodied the enduring fight for justice and equality, reminding them of the importance of challenging entrenched systems. Yet despite their differences, the two figures shared something unexpected: mutual respect. In subsequent interviews, each spoke highly of the other, acknowledging the value of engaging with opposing viewpoints. Leavitt, in particular, used her newfound platform to advocate for more constructive dialogue. "We live in a time when people are quick to dismiss anyone who disagrees with them," she said during one interview. "But real progress happens when we listen to each other, not just to refute, but to understand. Dr. Wolff and I may never see eye to eye on everything, and that's okay. What matters is that we're willing to have the conversation." Her words struck a chord, inspiring others to seek common ground in their own lives. Teachers incorporated the debate into lesson plans, using it as a case study in effective communication and critical thinking. Community organizations hosted watch parties, encouraging members to reflect on how they approach disagreements. Even politicians cited the exchange as an example of what public discourse should look like: respectful, substantive, and focused on solutions rather than blame. As weeks turned into months, the legacy of the debate continued to grow. Clips of the segment were shared in classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms, sparking discussions about economics, governance, and human potential. For many, it served as a reminder that even in a divided world, there is room for connection, if we're willing to put in the effort. Richard Wolff returned to his work with renewed vigor, incorporating insights from the debate into his lectures and writings. He began addressing questions about individual agency more explicitly, recognizing that dismissing personal effort alienated audiences who valued resilience and self-reliance. At the same time, he doubled down on his calls for systemic reform, urging listeners to think critically about the structures shaping their lives. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, embraced her role as a public figure, traveling the country to speak at conferences, universities, and community events. She published op-eds expanding on her arguments, emphasizing the importance of balancing systemic change with individual empowerment. Her message resonated deeply, earning her a loyal following and cementing her status as a leading voice in conservative thought. Ultimately, the debate between Richard Wolff and Karoline Leavitt transcended its original purpose. It wasn't just about critiquing Donald Trump or defending capitalism. It was about the power of ideas and the importance of engaging with those who challenge us. By refusing to shy away from difficult conversations, both participants reminded the world that progress begins with dialogue. And though they stood on opposite sides of the political spectrum, their willingness to engage with each other offered a glimmer of hope in an increasingly fractured society. As the story of their encounter unfolded, one thing became abundantly clear: moments of genuine connection and understanding are rare, but when they happen, they have the power to inspire change. Whether you agreed with Wolff's critique of capitalism or Leavitt's defense of opportunity, the debate proved that respectful disagreement could lead to growth for individuals, communities, and nations alike.